recording it.
Okay, so GDP. GDP stands for gross domestic product, and it is measured quarterly. It's the total value of goods and services in the country, and it also is a really important gauge on the overall health of an economy. So there's two different ways that you can compute GDP. Both of them should give you the exact same value every time. The only reason that we would ever use one over the other is if one was easier to compute than the other. And you'll obviously know when that'll happen. But spending approach is most commonly used in the US just because.
So sorry.
No, you're fine.
Two different ways to compute GDP: spending approach, income approach, result in the same GDP. Okay.
So they should give you the same value no matter what. They're just two different ways of looking at it, and then I'm going to explain them.
Okay.
So the spending approach is made up of consumption, investments, government purchases, and net exports. And then the income approach is made up of employee compensation, rent, interest, and profit.
Okay.
And then,
sorry, I am not trying to cut you off.
No, you're fine.
Spending approach is what again?
Spending approach is, so what's on this slide now is consumption, investments, government purchases, and net exports.
Okay.
So consumption is goods and services purchased by people, like consumers. Investments are private spending tools. So things like warehouses, factories, equipment, like different machines that you might need. And all investments are used to produce future outputs. So they're used to produce future goods that are going into GDP as well.
Okay.
And then government purchases are spending by all levels of government on finished goods and services, and this includes government consumption and government investments. One thing that government purchases don't include is like the moving of money. So if something like stimulus checks, for example, that money's already in GDP. It's not new money being added, it's just being moved and given to different people. Net exports is the last part of GDP, and those are going to be exports minus imports. Exports are goods that are produced in the domestically. So like for the US, if you were a US citizen, an export would be a good produced in the US that is purchased by someone in another country. So if we produced Apple computers and someone in Mexico bought an Apple computer, that would be an export. Imports are goods that are produced in other countries that are purchased in the US. So if Mexico produced apples and we bought them in the US, they would be considered imports. So net exports are exports minus imports. Some other things included in GDP. So intermediate goods are goods and services that are sold to firms at a later and bundled or processed with goods and services for sale at a later date. So an example of an intermediate good, well, I'll go finished goods are goods and services sold to final users and consumers and consumed by private inventories. So an example would be if Whole Foods bought oranges, that would be an intermediate good because they're using those oranges to produce, bless you, if they're using them to produce orange juice. So oranges would be the intermediate good and they would not be included in GDP because it would be considered double counting. So orange is the intermediate good and the finished good would be the orange juice because it's being purchased by personal inventories by people and not by the company, by a large corporation to be sold for something else. And then new goods and services. So only new goods and services are included in GDP. So if a house was built in 2005 and sold in 2023, it would not be included in the 2023 GDP. But if a house was built in 2023 and we're doing the GDP for 2023 and that house is sold, it would be included in GDP because it was built that year. Same thing for cars. Purchases of used cars are not included in GDP, but purchases of new cars are. And then work done in the US. So if a United States worker is working in Mexico, or a United States citizen is working in Mexico, they're going to be adding to the Mexico GDP. If a Mexican citizen is working in the US, they're adding to the United States GDP. Things not included, things that GDP does not include, it doesn't include black market goods or services or goods and services that are paid for under the table. GDP also doesn't include volunteer work. And it also is really hard to account for things that don't have like a price value. So things like environmental consequences, those don't have like a value to what they're taking away from our overall standard of living and overall health. So it's not it can't be included. Same thing with crime, health, and then this says economic activity. It's supposed to be economic equality. It straight GDP doesn't account for, some people might be very rich and there might be majority poor people, but those rich people raise the GDP. So it doesn't include for that. So some ways to correct this. So GDP has to be corrected for two things. It has to be corrected for inflation, and it also has to be corrected for population. In order to be the best way to measure how well people are living in a given society. Nominal GDP is GDP that is calculated using prices at the time of sale, and real GDP is calculated using the prices from the current year. So, and then to calculate for population, or to correct for population, we have to find the GDP per capita. And then on the next slide, I'll explain how to do that. GDP per capita is just GDP over population. So applying these changes. If the GDP in 2005 was $200 and the price level was 40, and the price level in 2006 is 60, what is the GDP in year 2005 and 2006 prices? So the first thing that we have to do is find the GDP growth rate. So that's the percentage change in GDP over time. So from the GDP in 2005 price level was $40, and then the price level in 2006 was $60. So do you know what the percent change and increase that is?
Wait, do you add that?
So you have to find the percent difference. So by how you do that is, well, how I do it is the difference is 20% or 20 between 40 and 60, like 40 plus 20.
You subtract that. The 40.
No, so you take the difference is 20. So I find what is 20 related to 40. So like if it was 10, it would be 10, or it would be a 25% increase because it's increasing by 1/4. Like 10 is 1/4 of 40.
Okay.
You know what I mean? Like 10 is a fourth of 40 and 25% is 0.25.
Yeah.
Which is a quarter. So those are all quarters, but here, so 20 is the increase between 40 and 60. And 20 and the different, or like the comparison with 20 and 40, 20 is half of 40. So it's 50%.
Okay.
So the GDP growth rate for this problem would be 50%.
Okay.
And then once you find so if the numbers were 20 and 40, it would, well, that would still be 50%. But like so like 40 and 10, like it would be 25% would be the increase. But here for this problem, it's 50. So the GDP growth rate is 50%, and then you take 50%, and that's how much the GDP growth rate has grown. So you multiply 50% by 200 because that's the original GDP price. And we're trying to find how much it increased. So we have the dollar amount for 2005, but we're trying to find it for 2006. So we would do $200 times 50%, and 50% of 200 is 100. So it would be 200 plus 100, which gives you 300. So 300 is your real GDP, and your nominal GDP is 200.
Okay.
Because the value in 2005 was $200 at a price level of 40. When the price level was 60 in 2006, that $200 is now in this world calculated or corrected for inflation. In 2006, it would be $300.
Mm-hmm.
And then for calculating for population, if the population was 400 and the GDP was 16 billion, what would be the GDP per capita? So GDP per capita was when we're correcting for population. And you calculate that by doing GDP over population, which for this problem, 400 million is the population and 16 billion is the GDP. And so the GDP per capita would be 40.
Okay.
And then in GDP, we have contracting GDPs, and we also, so contracting GDP is bad. It's when the growth rate is declining. And a recession is when we have 2 consecutive quarters of contracting GDP. So that would be like if we had 2 quarters consecutively where GDP was declining both times.
Okay.
We calculate for inflation and population because the best way to tell the standard of living in a country is to know the real GDP per capita. It corrects for all things, and it is strongly correlated to, or GDP is strongly correlated to the standard of living. So if you have a high GDP, you most likely have a high, or if you have a high real GDP per capita, you most likely have a very high standard of living. And if you have a low GDP per capita, you most likely have a very low standard of living.
Okay.
Do you have any questions? Is there anything you didn't understand? I can go back too. Or do you want to, I can make up another percent or another problem. Do you know how to define the percents?
Yeah, I think I know how to do that. I think it was just like it kind of went over my head for 5 seconds. I was like, what? Okay. I think I know how to do it. Can you go back to try the second slide, maybe? Can't remember if that's it exactly.
This one?
Okay, so from there, so the next slide over, is that talking about the spending approach or income approach? Like, what's the difference between those? Because I kind of, it went really fast. So I didn't really know.
Okay, so yeah, so the spending approach is that's what's on the next slide. And that the reason that I went in depth with that is because that's what we talked about the most in class and in the book. And that's what how we use to calculate our national GDP. So the spending approach is made up of consumptions, investments, government spending, and net exports. So do you understand what consumption is? Like anything that's purchased by someone, whether it's a service or a good, that's consumption. Investments aren't talking about they're not talking about stocks or anything like that. It's talking about things that are going to be used in the production of goods at a later date. So a factory, you need that to produce goods, or a machine, you need that to produce goods in the future. So those are all considered investments. Government, this says government expenditures. I say government spending. That's all the government's consumptions and all the government's investments. So paying for employees, different things like that, different government programs and things that the government has to buy for at any level of government. Those are all government spending. And then I said the one thing not included in that is going to be moving of money. So stimulus checks, things like that. And then net exports, you understand what exports are, you understand what imports are. So net exports are just exports minus imports. And then for the income approach is made up of, I think it's, okay, they're made up of employee compensation, rent, interest, and profit. So employee compensation is things like sick day or like paid vacation days, like health benefits, like if they pay for your insurance, all those things are employee compensation. Rent, which is like how much you're paying in rent. Interest, how much you're paying in interest, and profit, how much you're making. So it's the same because so the income approach is measuring what people are bringing in, and the spending approach is measuring what people are bringing out. So like if I lose $1, the reason that it's the same is like if I give you $1, you get the dollar. But if like you also are getting $1. So your income, like my spending would be $1, your income would be $1. So it's the same. Like whatever people are spending, someone's receiving that.
Yeah.
That's why the GDP is the same. And the next slide just, is like kind of what I just explained, like the different parts of it. But we use consumption, investments, government purchases, and net exports.
Okay. And then like right here on this page, intermediate goods, finished goods. What are finished goods like old goods, like used cars and stuff?
Finished goods are complete goods that are sold to consumers. So like I use the example of oranges and orange juice, but that one's kind of confusing. Like a better one is like I think the book used so the intermediate good would be the computer chip that is used in your computer, like the tiny little chip that has to be built by someone. So someone else buys that. So say a random company produces the chips for the computers. Apple buys the chips. When Apple buys the chips, those are considered intermediate goods and they aren't included in the GDP because Apple's going to take those chips and use each of them to produce a computer. And then they're going to sell the computer. So if we counted the chip when it came from the factory and then counted it again when it was sold by Apple, it's considered double counting. So we only count the purchase of finished goods. So the finished good is the computer that Apple produced, and the intermediate good is the chip.
Yeah.
So it's like a part of something. Like I think of intermediate goods as like a part of a finished good.
Okay, so part of a finished good. Okay. Okay, that makes sense.
And then the stuff with the new goods and services, it's just like the only thing that I really find it applicable with is like houses or cars because I don't know, it's just like the only thing I can think of. But so like a new car would be included in GDP, a 2024 car. Like it's the year 2024, someone buys a 2024 car with 0 miles on it. That's included in GDP. But if someone buys a car from a used car dealership it's the year 2024 and the car is a 2017, that wouldn't be included in GDP because it was already included when it was originally sold.
Okay.
And GDP just measures the overall health of the economy, all goods and services purchased.
Okay. Makes sense. You can go to the next slide. Black market, is this like when you're like babysitting, like paid under the table, stuff like that doesn't count
That
for
would
tax?
be paid under the table. I'm pretty sure that's something that I had like are under the table and black market goods, the same thing. I think that they are. People just think of black market goods as like drugs and guns and stuff, which like, that those aren't included in GDP, like, because they're still illegal sales. But a babysitter, a nanny, like a kid that comes and mows your lawn, like those things aren't included in GDP either. And
Okay.
there's volunteer work.
Oh, and volunteer work. Oh yeah, okay. And then go to the next one. Okay. And what is this about?
So this was like for inflation to correct GDP has, in order to be an accurate measure of the standard of living, you have to correct it for inflation, which is like the dollar amount change, the change in the dollar value amount, which is like the price. So on that was like the example that we did, like we were measuring, we were correcting for inflation. The price level changed by 50%. So then that was like the growth rate. So that was calculating for inflation. And then for population, you find the GDP per capita. So you divide population by GDP. That one's a lot easier.
Okay.
So back to this. So like this problem is explaining it or correcting for inflation, which is finding that's nominal GDP versus real GDP. So nominal GDP is the price value for that year. So it's not calculating for inflation or not correcting for inflation. And real GDP is correcting for inflation. So here, GDP in 2005 was $200. That's the real GDP, or the nominal GDP here is 40 because that's the price level. The $200 is how much the like money was worth. Or how much profits they made. So by 2006, we calculated for the growth rate, which was 50%, and then 50% of 200 is 100. So then you add 100 and 200, that gives you 300, and that gives you that's the real GDP. So 300 would be the real GDP, and 200 would be the nominal GDP.
Okay, makes sense.
And then down there is for population. And then they're all standard of living is best correlated with real GDP per capita. You have any other questions or anything else?
No, I think that was it.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a
Bye-bye.
good day.
Yeah.
Bye.